Hello and welcome to what I believe should be your penultimate lesson on the approaches. I think next time all we're doing is comparing the different approaches, and then that should be the end of the module, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Anyway, today we're going to be looking at the humanistic approach, and today I'm going to outline and evaluate it for you because some of the evaluation is going to involve some topics which you won't have really come across yet. So we're going to be looking at a few A-level, like A2 topics, such as free will versus determinism, as well as reductionism versus holism. You will cover these in more depth when you come to the issues and debates module. So I'm just going to give a very brief outline so that you can understand them in the context of this approach, rather than going into as much detail as you will next year. So the humanistic approach was kind of a rejection of the status quo at the time. So in the 50s, the two main schools of psychology that we had were behaviorism, which you've learned about, and psychodynamics, which was mostly Freudian psychology, which you've also learned about. Rogers, at the time, rejected both of these. So he felt that behaviorism was far too deterministic and that humans were unique and could not be compared to animals. So if you think back to the early behaviorist research that you looked at, like Pavlov and Skinner, most of what they did involved animal research. So Pavlov and his dogs, and Skinner and his rats/pigeons. They would carry out research on animals, and they would extrapolate that to use it to explain human behaviour. And Rogers said that we can't do that because humans are far too special and unique, and we can't compare them to animals at all. He also felt that Freud was overemphasising the kind of negative aspects of the human condition. So Freud tended to look at how our unconscious processes would inform our trauma and lead us to issues such as depression and things like that. Whereas what Rogers wanted to do was look at how healthy, happy, positive human experiences came about, and rather than focusing on the origins of things like psychopathology, he wanted to just look at everyday functioning of people. So humanistic psychology focuses on people as unique and free-willed beings who seek out their own personal growth and happiness. So the first of those kind of debates that I mentioned, which has come up here, is free will versus determinism. So free will is much more self-explanatory, and it just means that it's the idea that human beings are free agents and therefore they can choose how to think and behave. Whereas determinism would be this idea that human behaviour is determined by various forces which we ourselves do not control. So for example, the biological approach would say that our behaviour is determined by a combination of our genetics, our neurotransmitters, and our brain structures. So you can see here, the approaches we've looked at are all deterministic to some degree, even though they might not agree on what it is which is determining our behaviour. So the behaviourist and social learning approach believe that our behaviour is caused by our environment and what we learn from our environment. The cognitive approach assumes that our behaviour is caused by the thoughts that we have and mental processes. So cognitive structures, like schema, will affect how we think and therefore affect how we behave, and we have no control over the schema which our brain develops. Likewise, the psychodynamic approach assumes that our subconsciousness is what determines our behaviour, and the biological approach, as I said, assumes that biological factors are what cause our behaviour. And the humanistic approach rejects this idea completely and says that our behaviour is not determined by anything apart from us. So as a result of this, because the humanistic approach believes that we have free will, it rejects the idea that we are able to scientifically study the causes of behaviour. So humanistic psychologists believe that all human beings are completely unique and different to one another. So the most important thing that we as psychologists should be trying to understand is the subjective experiences of each individual person. So a big concept in humanistic psychology is this idea of self-actualization, and this is the idea that all people are driven to achieve their full potential, whatever that full potential might mean to that person in particular. And so achieving your fullest potential and what that means to you is self-actualization. So for example, for me, achieving my goal of becoming a fully qualified teacher would be self-actualization, because that to me is reaching my full potential in the way that I want to. However, for someone else, self-actualization might mean becoming the best theatre performer that they could possibly be, and someone else it could be the best pianist that they could possibly be. So you can see that self-actualization is very different for different people. So this fits in with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which some of you may have heard of before. So basically what Maslow suggested is that we have a hierarchy of needs, and we can't move on to the next part of the pyramid until we've met the current need. So our base needs are physiological needs. So we need things like air, water, food, shelter, all these kinds of things before we can start looking at this higher need of safety. So if you think, if you're living in a situation where you don't even have food and you're starving, things like finding property is going to be less of a priority for you than just being able to get some food right now. So once you're able to do these base physiological needs, we can start looking at like personal security. And once you have both of these, you'll start making more friendships, looking to find a sense of belonging in your community, and from there you can start to work on your personal self-esteem. And once you have all of these, you can finally start to self-actualize and pursue your full potential, which does make sense. You can't be pursuing your full potential of wanting to be the best pianist in the entire world if you don't even have enough food to survive. So Maslow broke these down into two different kinds of needs. So deficiency needs is everything down here, and they're called deficiency needs because the more you achieve it, the less motivated you are to continue seeking it. So the best way to kind of understand this is with an example. So like food, the more you achieve your need for food, so when you eat, you become less motivated to seek out more food, i.e. you're hungry, you have motivation to get food, you eat, and then that reduces your motivation because you stop being hungry. On the other hand, self-actualization is a growth need, because the more we achieve it, the more motivated we are to continue achieving. So if you end up getting, say, an A in one of your tests, that will actually motivate you to continue working harder to get more good grades in the future, rather than making you reduce your workload or something like that. So humanistic psychology can explain psychological problems. I know it did talk about this idea that it focuses on the positive, but it does also provide some insight into where psychological issues might arise. So two key terms here are the self and the ideal self. So how you see yourself is just called the self, quite simple, and how people believe they should be is called the ideal self. The extent to which the self and the ideal self overlap with one another is called congruence. So low levels of congruence can lead to negative self-perceptions, feelings of worthlessness, and very low self-esteem. So if you think if the way you see yourself is completely different to how you think you should be, that's going to cause you some distress because you have this low congruence. So you can see here, where you have this idea of the self overlapping quite a lot with the ideal version of yourself, you have high levels of congruence, which means you have good self-esteem and high levels of well-being. Where there's very little overlap and therefore low congruence, we have low self-esteem and low levels of well-being. Rogers suggested that some of these issues with self-esteem stem from childhood, so where parents fail to provide unconditional love to their children. So if parents only provide their love on conditions, it sends the signal that a person's worth is determined by their ability to meet that specific criteria. So for example, I will only love you if you do well at school. Now obviously, most parents aren't going to explicitly say to their child, if you don't do well at school, I'm going to stop loving you. But through their behaviours, they can send that message. So for example, if a parent is incredibly loving and gives their child lots of presents and hugs and all that good stuff when they do very well at school, but then if they don't do well at school, they suddenly start acting very cold towards that child, that is sending the message that the child is only deserving of love if they achieve well at school. And that can lead to this idea that if you don't meet that criteria, then you are a worthless human being, which obviously is going to cause you some distress if you then fail to meet those standards. So as a result of this, Rogers came up with this idea of unconditional positive regard. So because many psychological issues arise from a lack of unconditional love, Rogers proposed that what therapists should do is try to fill that gap and provide unconditional positive regard. And what this means is, no matter what the client's situation, the therapist will always treat them like they have value and treat them positively and warmly. So this means that the client can always feel that they have value no matter what their actual situation is. So instead of feeling that if they fail to meet certain criteria, they are worthless, they'll feel that they have worth no matter what. They're just a worthwhile human being who happens to be in a bad spot at the moment. And the aim of this therapy is to increase congruence between the self and the ideal self. So if you see here, the therapist will provide unconditional positive regard. This will improve perceptions of the self, which will therefore bring the self into closer alignment with the ideal self, increasing levels of congruence, which mean, as we said earlier, you have this good self-esteem and improved levels of well-being. So this brings us on to finally evaluating the humanistic approach. So we've got a real-world application that we just covered. Unconditional positive regard, which is a humanistic idea, is an important concept which has completely revolutionized psychotherapy. I believe you would have learned about unconditional positive regard in the context of cognitive behavioral therapy. This is its origins. So this idea that therapists should treat their clients with absolute positive regard always, rather than judging them. Another positive is that it's holistic, or you could say that it's not reductionist. They just mean the same thing. What this means is this is another one of those topics you'll cover in more detail next year. So what this means is it accounts for the whole human experience rather than trying to break the human mind down into smaller components. It's a positive approach, so it's quite an optimistic approach, and it sees all people as good and free to work towards their goals of self-improvement, which was quite a breath of fresh air at the time compared to Freud, who saw everyone as kind of existing in this state of misery because of their psychodynamic functions that were going on in their subconsciousness, and the behaviorist approach, which saw us as just automata that follow our conditioning from our environment. So that was quite nice. However, the negatives are that outside of unconditional positive regard, there's actually very little application. So humanistic psychology has not had a great amount of impact on psychology as an academic discipline. And this may be because of this second negative evaluation point, which is that a lot of the concepts are completely untestable and they can't be falsified. So this idea of self-actualization, as much as it might be a lovely concept, how could we actually test that in a scientific setting? Because if someone says that they're happy, does that mean that they're actually achieving self-actualization, or does it not? It's hard to tell. It's very subjective. And finally, there may be some element of cultural bias. So these ideas of personal growth and self-actualization might be more applicable to individualistic cultures, where we tend to seek our own personal development, whereas in collectivist cultures, which might favour the carrying out actions which benefit your family or benefiting your community above yourself, the idea that everyone should be striving for self-actualization might not really fit with their cultural values. So we can say that the humanistic approach has a cultural bias because it might not apply to every single different culture. So thank you very much, guys. I'm going to be posting an essay onto Google Classroom, and I'll give you about a week to complete that. Thank you very much.